It's not in the face! Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Hey, Not the Face with your host, John Nash, and your producer, me, Steffi Haynes. And today we have a hodgepodge episode for you guys, and we haven't given y'all one of those in several weeks. So we figured it's time to pick and pull from the headlines and answer some questions that you guys might be asking yourselves the same way as me. But first, let's check in with John and see how he's been, because he's back home in LA.
Yeah, I'm I don't want to say great, but it's nice to be home, but I don't know, I might be coughing a bit here. I have a little congestion because of the LA air. It's not quite as clean as the Minnesota air. So I'm running little problems there, but I think I'll live.
Well, I hope so, because we've got some stuff to chew on here. Are you ready?
Hell no.
Get ready anyways, because we're doing this.
Let me take a swig of the old Jack Daniels and some uppers and.
All right. So first things first, we see from Twitter and YouTube that a lot of fighters are apparently unaware, or at least only minimally aware of the settlement. How big of a concern should this be?
This is kind of alarming to me. We had some interactions on Twitter. Fortunately, one fighter's wife is right on top of it, apparently, keeping track of tabs and the whole thing. We saw Aljamain Sterling tweeted in response to an Eric McGracken tweet about, there's money coming to us for doing nothing, as though he was unaware. We saw Eddie Alvarez on his podcast. They seemed a little, not Eddie Alvarez, sorry, Frankie Edgar. Frankie Edgar on his podcast seemed a little confused about what the dates were the class action covered, what the payments were for. And it makes me a little concerned because the fighters have to be somewhat proactive to get the money. Now, the plaintiffs, when the judge approves, they have a whole method of contacting the fighters. They're going to they have a list of all their addresses and contact information from the UFC. So they're going to reach out and send through mail, through email, through text messages, phone calls, try to contact those fighters. But there's no guarantee that that information is correct. And there's no guarantee those fighters will respond to their inquiries. And so they're also hoping that when the news gets out, fighters will check out the website, update their information. But again, if fighters aren't paying attention, if they're in the dark completely on this, which a lot of them seem to be, there's a good chance that they don't update their information there. And there's a good chance too, based on the nature of fighters and my interactions with them, there's a sizable percentage that are completely out of the loop or are so, let's say, suspicious of anything, will not reply to any inquiries or will not give their information. If that's the case, there could be a large number of fighters that don't collect when the final settlement comes. If it does, it hasn't been finally approved, but if it does, they have a limited time up until, I don't know what the window is. I think it was 45 days. They said originally they're going to have to get back on their information. It might be stretched out by the judge, but by June next year, the claims have to be approved. And if they're not, those fighters could be missing out on, for them, sizable amounts of money.
Yeah. I mean, one more time, if you wouldn't mind reminding us what the least amount the fighters from the Lee settlement could get. Just the least amount.
Yep. The least amount for a Leaf class fighter. Now remember, that's anybody that fought in the UFC from December 16, 2010 until June 30th, 2017. The minimum is about, I think, $15,000. That's the very minimum. Those are people that fought on low-end contracts and only had one fight in the UFC. If you have more than one fight, you're guaranteed more than that. So one fight in the UFC, but there's a number of fighters are going to be getting, 100,000. Tom Lawler, filthy rich Tom Lawler now. He was on talking on the Wrestling Observer newsletter podcast, one of their shows. And he had found out how much he's going to get, and it's a minimum, I think, of $175,000, and he had 6 fights during the period.
Mm-hmm.
So for a lot of fighters, I think they'll be shocked. Listen, it's not the mega amount that some people were hoping for. Although for, guys like Conor McGregor or Anderson Silva or Brock Lesnar, it's probably a very large amount. We can estimate theirs, and it's in the millions for each of them. But for a lot of guys that made maybe 100,000 in the UFC over 6-7 fights, they are looking to get more from this settlement than they made during their UFC career. So this is money that, and that's after attorney fees. I mean, they still have to pay their taxes on it, but after attorney's fees. So this is, unlike what they made in the UFC where they had to pay for training and management and all that other stuff, this money they get on the settlement, this could possibly be some sort of nest egg that could do a lot of fighters good, considering their health problems, if they're, needing a down payment on a home, college debt, whatever they have, this money could come in handy for a large number of them.
All right.
And so reminder, as Stephanie, as the saint she is, in every episode we do in the text on the Substack, she puts the contact information for fighters, if you're listening, so you can contact them or just go to UFCclassaction.com and they have an entry form so you can give your information to the plaintiffs, they can get a hold of you. So I would recommend you do that so you do not miss out on your settlement.
Our next topic in today's hodgepodge is the election, because on Tuesday, most people are going to go vote, because even though early voting started last week or the week before, a lot of people wait until Tuesday to vote. But we are seeing so much support from the UFC and UFC fighters for Trump. Like it's ramped up times 10 than it normally is. Why do you think he's getting so much support, not just from the UFC, now from the fighters?
Well, I think Trump appeals to the UFC fighters. I think they're intentionally appealing to UFC fighters too. The one thing we've noticed the Republican Party and the Trump campaign has done, and they've talked about this, is they have specifically targeted young men, right? And the UFC appeals to young men, and so they've used the UFC as a platform to reach that audience. They also discuss a lot of items that are much more appealing to young men. There's a tremendous gender divide now in the electoral process in the two parties, the two candidates. I say, besides the fact that there are different genders, women, Harris is just outpolling on women just by, I can't remember, 10, 15, 20%, just a tremendous gap between the two. I shouldn't say 20, but I think it's 10%. It's double digits. And Trump's almost the same with men. So that's a tremendous disparity. And you look at the men, UFC fighters, not just men, the women too, Miesha Tate, the people that Trump appeals to, the UFC fighters, they're almost a perfect representation of them. A lot of them, they're independent businessmen. They believe in everything is, self-reliance, that the government, keep the government out of everything. They're often, they top, I don't want to say authoritarian. Sounds a little derogatory, but there's an authoritarian mindset there where it's top, there's a strong leader we need. They are a little xenophobic. There's a bunch of things that lead them to support Trump. They are the people that you would imagine that would be a Trump supporter. When you're in a sport where it's like only the strong survive and you get no outside help and you make it or you lose on your own and life's unfair, that's a message that resonates for men more than women, and it's a message that the Trump has been targeting. And so that's also why they go get UFC fighters, and they specifically target them to help spread their message, because they know they appeal to young men. Now, we'll have to wait and see if that's successful, because there's two things I've known in the history of elections is one, non-college people vote less than college. And so we're talking about non-college here mostly. Men vote less than women, and young people don't vote at all. And so their plan is to get a lot of young men voting that normally don't show up in the polls. But that could backfire, because the history of voting shows us that's the one group you don't really go after, because they're the least likely to vote. So we will see if that's successful. But that's why they're going after those fighters. That's why, I mean, it's understandable why the fighters support him, because he appeals to, people like the fighters. But they go to the UFC, and they got the UFC putting up a platform, and they're contacting fighters to help on the campaign because they think they can reach an audience that normally would not be reached.
Are we also looking at a situation where UFC fighters want to please the UFC, and they can clearly see that the UFC is giving Trump this huge boost, and it's clear that they're backing him? And, as you said, they're already collecting them and paying them to go out and spread the word. So are we maybe looking at something else where that maybe they're afraid to say anything else?
I don't think that's the case. It's interesting. Kareem Saddam has a article, he has, I think, a podcast series about this subject, about the UFC and Trump kind of unifying. And you go back to 2011, 12, I think it was, the UFC did basically a promotion, not a promotion, but a campaign event for Obama and Biden. And they brought Chuck Liddell and some other fighters. And they met with Biden in support of him. And it kind of shows the transformation of the UFC. The UFC was not an incredibly political business back then, but they saw, they saw value in how popular Obama was. And I think the fighters in that case, I don't think those guys were very supportive or even cared about politics at all. So that's why they showed up in support for this event. But nowadays, I think it's easy for the UFC to say, hey, who wants to work with this guy and show up and campaign for Trump? We will link you together, and they will get plenty of volunteers. And part of it might be like, oh, the UFC's giving the green light. I'll do it. I'll make them happy. Partly, but I think for the most part, these are fighters that are gung ho about supporting Trump, and they see this as a way. And the way that the UFC and Trump have worked together, I guess they also think, like with what happened with Colby Covington and Masvidal, it is potentially a way to get some more shine on them. There might be a little bit of a self-interest motive from some fighters. I don't think it's to please the UFC as much as maybe I will get more attention if I'm showing, if I'm showing supporting Trump, and maybe the Trump campaign will get some limelight on me as well. But I think for almost the most part, you could tell the fighters are very supportive. I shouldn't say all of them. There's a lot of fighters I know that are not. A few on Twitter more quietly, but there's a lot of fighters I know are on the opposite side of the fence. But the most public ones are the Trump supporters.
Now, we have talked before about why UFC proper, the business, would want Trump to win so badly, but we also have a lot of new subscribers and a lot of new listeners. So let's go back and revisit that and explain one more time why the UFC needs Trump to win.
Yeah, I mean, it's one thing Dana White being friends with Trump, and I'm not going to say they're not friends. There was a period, though, they didn't talk about each other much, right? It's, only in recent years have they talked about each other nonstop about their close friendship. But for like Dana White wanting Trump to win, it makes sense. He has a relationship, he's friends, but that's different than the UFC going full board on the Trump bandwagon, right? And that means that has to come from permission from Endeavor, the majority stockholders right now, since they've gone public with 51% of the shares, Ari Emanuel. They have to give the green light to use the UFC as a platform. And there's a strong relationship between Trump and the UFC that is very transactional. Like I said, the fighters support Trump because they legitimately support Trump. Dana White probably supports Trump because he legitimately supports Trump. But I bet you if the bosses, the majority shareholders, the executives of Endeavor told him, we can't have you publicly out there doing this, he would rein it in. But they've given him the green light. And the reason is it's a transactional relationship is because Trump does good for Endeavor and the UFC. They have, look at what UFC's position is right now. Just the UFC, we're not even thinking about the other business ventures of TKO and Endeavor. The UFC is worried about antitrust issues, right? They're worried that they're being sued in a court. They just settled the Lee case. They have a Johnson case, which has arbitration agreements that have to be looked over by courts that potentially could lead to injunctive relief or much higher damages. They have potentially then the DOJ or the FTC could look into them for antitrust violations, right? So they have a big concern on that front. On the other side, their fighters, they have a concern about them being found by the NLRB or some other agency as employees. They don't want that. And so it's a benefit to them to put into office someone like Trump, because as we've seen in the past, Trump assigned, who did he put in charge of the Department of Justice's antitrust division? Macon Delorme. Who is Macon Delorme? Well, he was a former lobbyist for the UFC, Zuffa. He also, since leaving the White House under Trump and leaving his position, he's gone to be an attorney for the law firm that represents who? The UFC. So they have a very close relationship. He has said he would get rid of Lena Khan and Cantor over at the Department of Justice, the antitrust enforcers. He is the type of person that would, in fact, his allies want to make the NLRB considered unconstitutional. So the idea that they would come in and enforce employee status would no longer be concerned. So all those reasons make it obvious. Why would the people that own the UFC want Trump in office from their point of view? From their point of view, if we have him in office, we no longer have to be concerned about these agencies investigating us for antitrust violations or for misclassifying our employees. So that's a major concern for the UFC off the table. And on the front of the current civil lawsuit, they know that if Trump comes in office, more justices from the Federalist Society will be appointed. And so as that case winds through the court system, it's much more likely the justice system, the Supreme Court, the appellate courts will enforce the rules that say that arbitration agreements are legal, class action waivers are legal, and that they can be upheld. And that would protect them from future antitrust. And, it might seem people like, well, do they really care about that stuff that much? Well, this is a company that's right now seeing almost $1.5 billion in revenue and EBITDA margins of over 50%, and are looking to see those increase up to $3 billion in revenues in future years and billions of dollars of profit per year. I would think that kind of money on the table would put you in the position where, like, we got to make sure we put into office with all the strength we can someone that's going to guarantee that money train will not be interrupted at all. And so I think it's clear cut what the UFC gets out of it with the Trump administration. Doesn't mean Harris is going to do those things for sure. But with Harris, there's a question mark, because is she going to keep Lena Khan around? Is she going to keep Cantor around? Who's going to be staff in the NLRB, things like that. Who's she going to appoint to the judges? Liberal judges seem to be much more open to the idea that arbitration agreements, these enforced arbitration agreements, should be ruled unconstitutional. So just from that, they know for sure what they're getting with Trump. I mean, his campaign manager is a former UFC official. They're tied very closely together. They know exactly what they get from Trump. I'm sure that's why they'll be very happy to see him return to office.
All right, so we're going to switch gears again here, and we're going to talk about gambling, specifically Conor McGregor. Now, over the past couple of years, we've been witness to a deep investigation into James Krause and some illegal gambling that went on. And in essence, that forced the UFC to put out a new policy stating that no UFC fighter or their family members, their loved ones, their direct circle, their inner circle, cannot place bets on UFC fights. Now, I'm not talking about boxing, and I'm not talking about Conor McGregor placing a bet on Francis Ngannou in the PFL. It's specific to UFC fights. So we have been seeing Conor McGregor publicly make huge bets on UFC fights. We've seen him do it for the last Alex Pereira match with Khalil Roundtree, and we also saw him do it with the Ilia Topuria and Max Holloway match. How is it that he can publicly make bets on him on these matches? How is this happening?
Well, we should compliment, who was the person that brought this up on Twitter to us?
Princess Shar. She has been asking, and so it is her we should credit for the question.
Okay, so Princess Shar. So it's something that kind of just I didn't even think about, right? I saw him doing it, and then you brought up, yes, they have this whole new policy. People remember in their new athlete, actually it's the UFC athlete conduct policy, which is at the end of every contract. They have new language that says, and this came out just last year, I think. I can't remember exactly, but it has wagering restrictions. And then it talks about how you can't, as an insider, you can't make betting. Basically, as a bunch of things, you can't make bets on UFC events. Insiders, basically your coaches, your managers can't make bets either. So there's these wide-reaching rules they put in place. Now, that's supposed to apply to all fighters. The question I have, and what I think is happening here, is that remember when Conor McGregor signed his contract, it was back in his new contract. It was back in 2018, shortly before he fought Khabib at UFC 229. I was looking at contracts from back then. Now, obviously, Conor's contracts is different. He gets paid a lot more. But one thing we've noticed about the UFC contracts, even with the stars, the ones we've gotten, is the lot of the language restrictions are universal. They're contracts of adhesion. There might be differences of the number of fights. There might be differences of the amount of money you get paid. But almost everything else, in fact, I think they had a stat once during a period that every fighter had a champions clause. Every fighter had these extension policies. Every fighter's contract had the image rights. They're universal. Even the stars can't get out of those or get those rewritten. They can get other parts rewritten, but not those sections. And I kind of assume it's probably the same for Conor McGregor. They're protective of this stuff. There might be some changes to his athlete conduct policy because he's a star. They make him more leeway when to show up, things like that. But look, forgetting him, looking at contracts in that period when he signed it, there is nothing about wagering in those. They talk about all these types of behaviors, but nothing about gambling and wagering. And so normally what the UFC does when they issue a new policy is they put it in the new contracts, or as an addendum, they put it in the bout agreements. And so when you have a new bout, you have this addendum and you have to sign that addendum as well as the bout agreement for the fight to go through. My guess is either one, McGregor signed this addendum and is just violating it, doesn't care, right? Or two, he never signed a bout agreement when he was going to fight Chandler, or refused to sign the addendum that comes with it about the wagering part. And so he does not have that in his contract. Now, they have rules in the UFC that also say, like, we can change this on our own and fighters have to respect the changes. McGregor could probably pretty easily, with the attorneys he can afford, and he should not be under an arbitration agreement either, resist this. And the UFC knows that. So that's my guess, is he is gambling like this that no other MMA UFC fighter can do, behave this way, because he has an older contract and he has not signed or approved the addendum that has the new updated language, unlike all the other fighters that basically have to accept it.
Question. You said that he might not have signed his bout agreement for Chandler. Would you mind explaining that timeline? Because I know that he missed his June 3rd press conference in Ireland for his June 29th bout with Chandler. And they announced somewhere in between. So can you tell us why he may not have signed his bout agreement?
Well, it's not uncommon. I mean, most fighters sign it right away. But certain fighters, while they're negotiating a contract, they might verbally agree to the fight, and there's some negotiations going on for maybe a new agreement. And so you can't sign the bout agreement until you have the new contract in place, because you're agreeing to get your pay that night and stuff based on that. Now, it's also common knowledge, apparently, in the MMA world, that McGregor does not sign his bout agreement till the end, like a week before, 2 weeks before. At least he's done. That's what he did with Aldo and the Mendez fight and a bunch of other fights during his career. He's waited the last second, and Khabib too, to sign the bout agreement, partly because he was in negotiations over contracts and stuff. But he might have taken that same stance on this one and did not plan on signing it only until a couple of weeks before the fight. Now, you look at the timeline, he didn't officially drop out of the fight till like 2.5, 3 weeks before the card.
It was 16 days before. Yeah. It was on June 13th.
16 days, June 13th. But June 3rd, he missed the press conference. Right. And everybody kind of knows what happened there, even though they don't say it, is he got injured earlier and they knew he was not going to make the fight or had questions. And because it had such a massive gate, they did not want to cancel the event or announce a replacement fight so soon. They were out looking for the best replacement fight they could get, because they wanted to retain as many of those people that bought tickets as possible. They didn't want to have to give refunds to all those people, so they could preserve and they ended up with like a $16 million gate, one of the biggest in UFC history. It just was much smaller than would have been if McGregor was there. And so that's what they did to preserve the gate. And so, if you look at it like that, it wasn't just he didn't sign the bout agreement 16 days before the event. He, up to a month or more, he knew he probably wasn't going to be in the event. And at that point, they weren't signing any bout agreement. And so if there was an addendum in the bout agreement, or they had some sort of contract portion on this, or maybe they decided, listen, we are not going to ask Conor McGregor. It's hard enough to get him to show up. We are not going to expect him to sign a new athlete conduct policy. I mean, if he's smart, I wouldn't sign it considering how he conducts himself.
Yeah. Well, that leads me to one final question on this topic, and that is, because he's Conor McGregor and because he is allowed like different kinds of sponsors and stuff, could it be that he just basically negotiated his way out of that, because he does work with gambling sites, and he has for quite some time? Like before this Dual Bits, he had another one he had been doing stuff with for like 2 or 3 years. So I guess my question is, could he have negotiated his way out of this because of sponsors? To access the bonus content of this episode, you must be a paid subscriber. To do that, go to heynottheface.substack.com and subscribe today.
Ow! Ow! Not the face! Ooh! Ooh! Okay, the face!